One last ed puzzle, a final exam review. To start us off, what makes Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior different from traditional formulations such as speech or linguistics? Why do we explicitly say that we're studying and teaching verbal behavior instead of language or speech? Why might it be beneficial for us to analyze verbal behavior in this way, based on a functional analysis? Now, let's move on to defining verbal behavior. Here are a couple of concepts to get us started. First, an audience blanks reinforcement for verbal behavior. In turn, verbal behavior is maintained by... So, what is the full definition of verbal behavior? In that case, how exactly is verbal behavior different from nonverbal behavior? How is verbal behavior the same as nonverbal behavior, though? Some might say that the definition of verbal behavior is too broad. It seems like it could cover a lot of behaviors that people don't normally think of as verbal. However, it lets us focus on functional analysis and function-based intervention without worrying about the specific topography of the behavior. Since we're so focused on a functional analysis, what does functionally differentiate the different verbal operants? Let's start with the mand. The tact. How about the duplic? And the codic? And finally, the sequelic. Now we'll focus in a bit on mands. The primary antecedent control over a mand is a motivating operation. Motivating operations, whether conditioned or unconditioned, can be captured or contrived in order to teach mands. What are the three types of conditioned motivating operations? One type of CMO is created due to pairing with an already existing MO. If an original MO is pain and fear during a car crash, and that is paired with a particular intersection on a snowy day, that intersection may now become a CMO evoking the same behaviors as the original MO. What type of CMO is that? Another type of CMO is created due to it preceding a worsening or improvement of conditions. For example, an original MO is an aversive phone call, which would evoke behavior maintained by escaping that phone call. Now, stimuli that precede the phone call, such as seeing the name of the person come up on your phone, may evoke behavior maintained by avoiding the phone call. What type of CMO is this? The third type of CMO is a stimulus that affects the value of another stimulus due to the relation between the stimuli and an activity or behavior chain. For example, if you hear the SD make a sandwich, the previously neutral stimuli of bread, condiments, lunch meat, etc. become CMOs establishing the value of a knife. What mand might be evoked by those CMOs? And what type of CMO is it? When you go to the movie theater, the value of popcorn and behaviors leading to getting popcorn are momentarily increased. The theater is what type of CMO, given that it's been paired with the original motivating operation of hunger? You warm up some soup in the microwave. The presence of the bowl of soup is a CMO establishing the value of a spoon. A tone has consistently preceded a shock. The tone becomes what type of CMO, increasing the value of avoidance? You're often tired when you get to school, and every time you go to Starbucks, you get coffee. School becomes what type of CMO, establishing the value of coffee even when you've slept well? You receive your test and are asked to begin writing. The test becomes what type of CMO, establishing the value of a pen or pencil? On to tacts. Skinner reviewed several possible ways of teaching individuals to tact their own private events. One method involves noticing other events or stimuli, observable to others, that are probably correlated with the private event. For example, you observe a chair knocked to the ground and a red bump on a child's knee. You say, "Ow, that must hurt." The child learns to say, "Ow, that hurt," due to the pairing of the tact with the overt stimuli with her covert pain. Another method is to notice responses made at the same time at which the private event probably occurs. For example, you observe a child crying and holding her knee. You say, "Oh no, you hurt yourself." The child learns to say, "I hurt myself," due to the tact of her overt behavior being paired with her covert pain. A third method is to make use of stimulus generalization, teaching a learner to describe public stimuli and events such that they can then tact private stimuli and events in a similar way. For example, you teach a child to say hot when she is out in the sun or close to a campfire. She now says, "I'm hot" when she has a fever, due to stimulus generalization from the overt stimuli to the covert stimuli. Then we have tact extensions. What are the four different types? Here's the definition of one tact extension: an instance of verbal behavior in which a previously learned response occurs in the presence of a novel stimulus that has all of the relevant features of the stimulus that previously controlled the response. Which is it? An instance of verbal behavior in which a previously learned response form occurs in the presence of a novel stimulus that has some but not all of the relevant features of the stimulus that previously controlled the response. Which tact extension is this? What if we have an extension of a tact that occurs when a stimulus acquires control over the response because it frequently accompanies that stimulus upon which reinforcement is normally contingent? And finally, in the case of this type of tact extension, the property which gains control over the response is only distantly related to the defining property upon which standard reinforcements are contingent, or is similar to that property for irrelevant reasons. Now let's match up those terms to some examples we've seen before. If a child can accurately tact dog in the presence of various real dogs, and then the child encounters a ferret for the first time and says dog, what tact extension is that? Rob is learning the names of weird kitchen appliances. I hold up a mortar and pestle, and he blurts out cheese grater. What tact extension? Jen can accurately label different bookshelves in her house. She then goes to the library for the first time ever and says bookshelves. What tact extension is that? One more. Every morning, Nick walks downstairs and his mother points to the fridge and says, "I'll get you a glass of juice." Nick now goes to a friend's house, sees their fridge, and says, "Juice." What tact extension does this represent? Now our last big category of verbal operants, verbal behavior under the control of verbal stimuli. First, let's define some terms. When there is topographical correspondence between the antecedent stimulus and the response, they are said to have what? And when the controlling stimulus and the response are in the same sense mode and have correspondence as above, they're said to have what? What are the three main categories of verbal operants controlled by verbal stimuli? The first category has formal similarity with their controlling stimuli and thus also point-to-point correspondence. The next has point-to-point correspondence with their controlling stimuli, but not formal similarity. And finally, no formal similarity or point-to-point correspondence with their controlling stimuli. Which of these examples are duplics? And which of these examples are codics? Which of these examples are sequelics? Let's quick fire through some examples. Be specific now with exact kinds of duplics and codics if applicable. I say chair and you write down chair. I prompt, "What's your name?" "Sally." And the student says, "Sally." I ask, "What's your name?" And the student says, "Sally." You see verbal behavior on the board and write down verbal behavior. You see casa on the board and write down house. I say casa and you write down casa. It's important to remember that responses may be in the same modality as their controlling stimuli without having formal similarity. For example, an antecedent and response may both be written but don't match point to point. I write down Jessica and you write down your own name. No formal similarity there because there is not point-to-point correspondence. In addition, you never need to determine whether tacts or mans have formal similarity or point-to-point correspondence with their controlling antecedents. Those terms are not relevant to those operands. On to the topic covered most recently, multiple control. Remember, almost all responses are multiply controlled. We call something a pure operant only if it's controlled exclusively by its primary controlling variables, those that are used to define it. A pure tact is exclusively controlled by a nonverbal stimulus. You see a dog and you say dog. What other variables may affect an impure tact? What is the definition of divergent control? You can also give an example if you prefer. And how about convergent control? The latter is what we're talking about when we discuss the intersection of primary and supplementary controlling variables on a single response. Then we have specific types of control over responses. What is it called when the antecedent variable shares some topographical similarity with the response that it's affecting? How about when the antecedent variable and the response that it's affecting are related in some way that is not topographical? Skinner also talks about two ways that one can provide supplementary stimuli to affect responding. In one case, the person providing the supplementary stimulus knows the specific response that they're trying to occasion. In the other, the person providing the supplementary stimulus is not trying to occasion a specific response. They're trying to find out. Are these examples of prompts or probes? Are they likely to exert thematic control or formal? Your client is holding a kaleidoscope. You ask, what do you like about that? You say, how are you? Say, I'm fine. You say, what is the weather like today? Look outside before you answer. You hold up a picture and say, name all of the objects in this picture that you can. You say, name all of the animals that you can think of that start with B. Finally, we'll do some review of relational responding. This is all about how novel responding can emerge without direct teaching, a very important phenomenon if the development of a complex verbal repertoire is necessary. Indeed, some relations between stimuli, and thus the context of how verbal behavior is occasioned by those stimuli, are completely arbitrary, only formed through intricate verbal contingencies. The reading assigned for this course covered several types of relations between stimuli. One was the relation of coordination or sameness. This can also be a relation between stimuli that go together in some way. For example, I could teach you that a Greek word for love is agape. I reinforce your response of agape when I ask, what's a Greek word for love? I could then ask, what does agape mean? If you could respond, love, a symmetrical or mutually entailed relation has emerged without direct teaching. I could then also teach you that a written Greek word for love looks like this. When I ask you to write down the Greek word for love, I'd reinforce that response. If I then show you that word and ask what it means, and you say love, another symmetrical or mutually entailed relation has emerged without direct teaching. Now, if you're able to say agape in the presence of this word, and write down that word when I ask you to write agape, transitivity or combinatorial entailment has occurred without direct teaching. Now on to distinction, a relation of there simply being a difference between stimuli in some way. We've mostly reviewed non-arbitrary versions of this relation, so let's get wild and come up with an arbitrary one. How about movies that make you feel different ways? What We Do in the Shadows is one of my favorite comedies. This movie, and even just talking about it or seeing pictures from it, makes me laugh. Another movie that I like that makes me feel very different than What We Do in the Shadows is Coco. I definitely wouldn't call this a comedy, but it doesn't make me sad or angry or anything we would be likely to say is the opposite of funny. It's just different. The emergent relations here are pretty straightforward. If I've taught you that What We Do in the Shadows makes me feel different emotions than Coco, if I ask you for an example of a movie that makes me feel different than Coco, you would likely be able to respond with What We Do in the Shadows. I could teach you the exact same thing with regards to another movie that evokes different emotions. Pacific Rim is a movie that I enjoy that, again, doesn't exactly make me laugh. I enjoy it. It makes me happy and excited. Just different, not opposite, nor exactly the same. Keep in mind that combinatorially entailed relations between Coco and Pacific Rim will actually likely not emerge in this case. Just because they're both different than what we do in the shadows doesn't tell us whether they're different or similar to each other. Now let's review an arbitrary example of the relation of opposition. These can be a little tough since verbal behavior is so nuanced. Not everyone will agree that two words are actually opposites. I'm going with modern versus vintage. If I tell you that this type of cell phone is modern, and that's the opposite of a rotary phone, which is vintage, the symmetrical emergent relation that the rotary phone is the opposite of the cell phone should emerge. Same deal with teaching that a cell phone from the 80s is the opposite of a newer cell phone with regards to them being vintage versus modern, respectively. Interestingly, the emergent relation of combinatorial entailment between the rotary phone and the 80s cell phone is that they are the same with regards to both being vintage. Another type of relation between stimuli is comparison. Think of this relation as being along a spectrum. They're not complete opposites, and we don't just stop at the fact that they're different from each other. The stimuli are bigger or smaller, warmer or colder, brighter or darker, etc. As with opposition, a verbal community may or may not agree on the spectrum of an arbitrary relation between stimuli. For example, let's go with the difference in value between stimuli. I can teach you that an emerald ring is less expensive than a diamond ring. There's nothing physically observable about these stimuli that suggests this comparison. We've decided verbally as a culture that these have different worth. The relation that a diamond ring is more expensive than an emerald ring will then emerge. Now I'll teach that a seed pearl ring is less expensive than an emerald ring with the emergent relation that an emerald ring is more expensive. The emergent relations of combinatorial entailment or transitivity is that a seed pearl ring is less expensive than a diamond ring, and a diamond ring is more expensive than a seed pearl ring. Finally, hierarchies. A lot of complex and interesting relations between stimuli can emerge through this type of training. Let's use a hierarchy of sandwiches. Types of sandwiches include paninis and subs. In terms of emergent relations, paninis and subs are types of sandwiches. Paninis and subs are different types of sandwiches. We can then move on down the hierarchy. Subs can be cold or toasted. Hence, these cold and toasted foods are types of subs, and also types of sandwiches in general. A little more review, and you should be so ready for the final exam. We'll just click through these quickly. Answer with what operant these are examples of.